The music blared through the speakers as Kyle adjusted the mic stand, scanning the crowd that had gathered on the corner of Maple Street. His fingers tightened around the guitar pick, and he glanced at the banner hanging behind him. Youth Program Fundraiser, Kyle's Music for Change. Everything was set. The permits were in order. He had spent weeks coordinating with the city to get the necessary approvals. But, of course, it never mattered to people like Karen. "I'm calling the cops." Karen's voice rang out over the music, shrill and full of authority. She stood with her arms crossed, staring at Kyle from the edge of the crowd, her posture exuding the confidence of someone who knew they were about to have all the power. Kyle didn't even flinch. He had dealt with people like Karen before. People who judged him for his past, who saw his criminal record before they saw the man standing in front of them. He wasn't surprised. The officers were already on their way. Karen had done her part. She had her husband's connections after all. Officer Garcia arrived first, his hand resting on his holster. He glanced at the scene, taking in the loud music and the small group of people around Kyle. "Is everything all right here?" Garcia's voice was steady, but there was a hint of skepticism in his eyes. He was already sizing Kyle up, probably assumed he was some troublemaker just like Karen had. "Yeah, officer," Kyle said, putting his guitar down gently. "This is a charity event. I've got the permit to be here." He reached into his bag and pulled out the stack of paperwork. Karen stepped forward. "This isn't a charity event, officer. It's a public nuisance. The music's been blaring for hours, and you can see the kind of people he's bringing in. They're a distraction." Garcia raised an eyebrow, but he didn't immediately look at Karen. He was more interested in the permit Kyle had handed him. Karen's face was tight with frustration as she waited for Garcia to take her side. But Kyle noticed a subtle shift in the officer's posture as he started to look through the paperwork more carefully. Garcia muttered, scanning the permit. "It looks like everything's in order here." He paused, lifting his gaze to meet Karen's. "The event. It is approved by the city. That means it's legal. You might want to take that up with the city council, not with us." Karen's face turned red, her mouth opened, but no words came out for a moment. She stared at Garcia as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was used to people backing down when she made a scene, but not this time, not with Kyle. "I don't care about your paperwork," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I'm telling you, it's too loud and it's disturbing the peace." "Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to calm down," Garcia said, his tone firmer now. "Your complaint has been noted, but it doesn't change the fact that this event is legal. You're the one who's causing a disturbance now." The crowd that had gathered began murmuring, a few people exchanging looks. Kyle stood there, stunned for a brief second. It was almost surreal this was happening. The moment he had worked so hard for, to prove himself, was unfolding before him. Karen was silent now, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She hadn't expected to be so easily overruled, but as the truth settled in, her power over the situation crumbled. Kyle had done everything right, and the one thing she had clung to, her assumption that he was in the wrong, was shattered. The officer stepped closer to Karen, his voice low. "I suggest you reconsider your approach. If you keep escalating this, it'll reflect badly on you, not on him." Karen's face twisted in disbelief, and in that moment, Kyle felt a wave of triumph surge through him. This was more than just winning an argument. It was a victory over everything Karen had tried to impose on him. The moment Karen had started to complain, Kyle knew exactly where this was going. It wasn't the first time someone like her had tried to ruin something he'd worked for, and it wouldn't be the last. The truth was, Karen wasn't just upset about the music, she was upset about the kind of person Kyle was back in the early days. When Kyle first moved into the neighborhood, he had kept his head down, hoping that his past would be just that past. But Karen couldn't seem to let it go. He had done time, and the moment she found out, that was all she saw, not the guy who had spent years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Not the guy who'd been trying to rebuild his life, but the man she considered dangerous, someone beneath her. The weight of that label hung over him every time he encountered her. It wasn't as if he was living some kind of glamorous life now, far from it. His music was his only way to make ends meet, and to feel like he wasn't a prisoner of his own history. He had made, but Karen, with her overbearing sense of righteousness, couldn't understand that. To her, People like Kyle didn't deserve second chances, and certainly not the opportunity to hold a public event. When Kyle had first approached the city council for a permit, he had been cautious. His criminal record was public knowledge, and he had expected resistance. But, surprisingly, the council had been supportive. They knew about his efforts, knew about the program he was running. He had worked hard to build trust in the community. His reputation wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. The permit was granted, and Kyle was finally able to put his plans into action. Karen, however, had taken offense the moment. She saw the event posted on the community bulletin board. She didn't like the idea of someone like him drawing attention. She had spent years priding herself on being the neighborhood's watchdog, making sure that everything was proper, that everyone knew their place. And to her, Kyle's place wasn't on the stage or in front of the microphone. She hadn't even bothered to come to the event beforehand to see what it was really about. It wasn't about the noise or the disturbance. It was about control. It was about the way she could make people like Kyle feel small, make them second-guess their place in the world. She didn't like the fact that people were beginning to look at Kyle differently, not as a convict, but as a person who was trying to make a real difference. But Karen's power over the neighborhood was starting to slip. Her influence had always been tied to fear of what she might expose, fear of what she might say. People were afraid to challenge her because she knew how to use her connections. She knew how to manipulate a situation and make it look like she was in the right. But today was different. As Karen stood there, her mouth opening and closing, as she struggled to find the right words to justify her anger, Kyle felt a sense of relief that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just that he was winning the argument, it was that for the first time in years, he was standing up for himself without fear of being knocked back down. He thought about the people who had shown up to support him, the youth he was helping, and how much this meant. The program wasn't just a way to help. Kids was a symbol of what he had been through and where he was headed. It was proof that people could change, that even someone with a broken past could rebuild their life. But for Karen, that wasn't something she wanted to acknowledge. And now, as the officer finished reading the permit aloud, it was clear she was losing the battle she thought she had. Already won, as the confrontation continued to unfold in front of the crowd, Kyle couldn't help but reflect on the history. Between him and Karen, it wasn't just about noise complaints or neighborhood events. It was about the weight of the assumptions people like Karen carried, assumptions about his worth, his past, and his place in the world. He had always known that his past would haunt him, but he hadn't realized just how far someone like Karen would go to make sure it did. Karen's biases ran deep. They weren't just about the music or the noise. They were about her perception of people like Kyle, people who had been marked by their past, people who had made mistakes. Her upbringing had taught her that only certain kinds of people deserved a voice, a platform, and Kyle, in her eyes, was not one of them. Her father had been a high-ranking officer in the local police department, and her mother had always kept a tidy, perfectly manicured image. In their world, everything had its place, order, and anything that threatened that order was to be eliminated. Karen had been raised to see people as either proper or improper, and once you were categorized, there was no room for flexibility. Kyle, with his criminal record and rough edges, was very much in the latter category. His past mistakes didn't seem to matter in the face of his efforts to turn his life around. Karen saw only the label, ex-convict, troublemaker. To her, people like Kyle were a risk disruptive, incapable of change, always on the edge of failure. And so, when she found out about his event, it triggered something deep inside her. She couldn't stand the idea of him being given permission to make noise in her pristine neighborhood. It was a threat to the order she'd worked so hard to maintain. She had done her research, of course. She knew about Kyle's record, knew about the robbery charge that had sent him to prison for 5 years. But what Karen didn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand, was that Kyle had been innocent. The real criminal had been the one who had framed him, but the system had failed to see that. Kyle had been caught in a web of lies, and even though the truth had eventually come to light, the stigma remained, who didn't belong. But it wasn't just about Kyle's past. It was about Karen's need to maintain control. She had spent years establishing herself as the watchdog of the neighborhood, the one people turned to when they needed things to be fixed. To her, he was a symbol of disorder, of change she didn't want. She had been the one to call the police, the one to dictate the narrative. And she wasn't going to let go of that so easily. As the officer continued to read the permit, Karen's grip on the situation slipped further. Her carefully constructed image of herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's well-being was unraveling. She had been so sure of herself, so confident that her version of events would be the one people believed. Too late, she felt exposed, and her reaction was one of fury. Karen had never been forced to confront her own biases before. She had always relied on her social status and her connections to shield her from accountability. She was forced to face the truth. She had misjudged him. She had allowed her prejudices to cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had lost. Kyle stood tall, watching as Karen's facade began to crack. For the first time in years, he felt like he was more than just his past. He wasn't just a man trying to move on. He was a man whose efforts were being seen, whose worth was no longer defined by the mistakes of his youth. And as Karen stood there, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, he realized that the real victory wasn't just about winning the argument. It was about proving that change was possible, even for someone like him. Karen's frustration was now palpable, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel her grip on the situation slipping, and it sent a wave of panic through her. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience, and certainly not by someone like Kyle. The officer, Officer Garcia, had already taken his stance. He had validated Kyle's event, confirmed that everything was above board. The crowd was beginning to shift, their murmurs growing louder, more supportive of Kyle. The realization was dawning on everyone. Karen was in the wrong, her face flushed with anger. This was not how it was supposed to go. Kyle, with his perfect legal permits and his defiant demeanor, was ruining everything she had built. Her power in this neighborhood, her ability to control and dictate what was acceptable and what was not, was crumbling. It had always been her role to ensure that things stayed proper, that the people who didn't fit in could never get a foothold. Now, she was the one being exposed for what she really was. A petty, vindictive person trying to use her position to ruin the lives of others. She turned toward the officer, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. I don't care about his permits. This is a disturbance. He's breaking the law by causing such a ruckus. Can't you see that? Just because he's got paperwork doesn't mean he gets to ruin the peace of the whole neighborhood. Officer Garcia, who had been calm and collected until now, hesitated. His gaze shifted from Karen to the growing crowd, and he could feel the tide turning. The residents who had been quiet and uncertain were now watching with more focus. Heard the music, sure, but it wasn't the intrusive disturbance Karen made it out to be. The event had been advertised as a community charity event, but his voice lacked the firmness it had carried when he first arrived. But the fact remains that this event is legal. Kyle has done everything by the book, and as far as the noise is concerned, I don't see how this is any different from other events we've had around here. Karen's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, practically shaking with fury. But he's not the kind of person who should be allowed to do this. He's got a criminal record. He doesn't deserve to have this kind of attention. You can't let people like him, people who've done things in their past, just walk around like nothing happened. The words hung in the air like a bitter poison. Kyle's heart sank, but he didn't show it. Karen had always used his criminal past as ammunition against him, but it was never about the music, never about the event. It was about control. Karen had painted him as a danger to the community simply because of the life he had lived before. He had been wrongfully imprisoned before he had found his redemption through music and his youth program, and now she was trying to use his past to destroy him once more. You can't just let this happen, Karen almost screamed, her voice raw. This is not right. He's enough. Officer Garcia's voice finally cut through her hysteria. He stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, an unexpected gesture that forced her to pause. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, and I'm not going to change it just because you're uncomfortable with who Kyle is or what he's trying to do here. The crowd, which had been quietly observing, now began to murmur with more certainty. A few neighbors who had remained silent until now spoke up, sharing their support for Kyle. He's been nothing but good for the kids around here, one man said. I've seen him work with them at the youth center. The moment where his life could change, not because of his past, not because of Karen's accusations, but because people were beginning to see him for who he was now, Karen's face turned pale, her lips trembling with disbelief. She was losing control, and in that moment, she knew it. Her anger had lost its grip on her. Came when Officer Garcia turned to the crowd, speaking clearly and decisively. "This is a legal event, folks. Kyle's music stays." He paused, his eyes meeting Karen's for a brief moment. "I suggest you respect that." Karen's entire body stiffened as she realized the full extent of her defeat. She had miscalculated. She had assumed her connections and her position would be enough to crush someone like Kyle, but in this small battle, at least she had lost. Had won not through legal battles or paper wars, but by standing firm and refusing to let anyone define him by his past. Karen's shoulders slumped as she turned and walked away, the tension in her face finally releasing. The moment Karen turned and stormed off, the tension in the air didn't immediately dissipate. Kyle stood there, hands at his sides, trying to process what had just happened. It had all escalated so quickly. First, Karen's accusations, then the confrontation, and now the awkward silence that followed her exit. But the truth had come to light, and with it came an unexpected sense of vindication. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many of them exchanging quiet words with Kyle or offering supportive nods, Officer Garcia remained by his side. Kyle could feel the weight of the officer's gaze as if he were silently weighing his next words. He knew Garcia had been hesitant at first, unsure of how to handle the situation. But now, Kyle saw something else in the officer's eyes, something like recognition, maybe even regret. "You know," Garcia said, finally breaking the silence, "I had my doubts when I first arrived. I didn't know what to make of this whole thing. And I definitely wasn't expecting all of this." He gestured vaguely to the aftermath of the confrontation. "But I'm glad I took the time to go over everything more carefully. The permit is legit. You really did all the right things." Kyle felt a knot in his stomach loosen, but there was a sense of discomfort in Garcia's tone. The officer wasn't speaking just to reassure Kyle. He was wrestling with something deeper. "There's more to it, though," Garcia continued, glancing over at the documents Kyle had handed him earlier. "I noticed a clause in your permit that I missed the first time. I don't know how it slipped through. It's not just about the noise level restrictions. There's something about community approval." Kyle felt his pulse quicken, his heart sank. But before he could speak, Garcia went on, "It states that, in case of a public disturbance complaint, the city reserves the right to take action only if there's a direct violation of the terms stated in the permit. That's why you weren't in any real trouble today." She misinterpreted the complaint process entirely. Kyle's confusion deepened, and he asked, "But how is that possible? She was so sure I was breaking the law. How could she have gotten that part wrong?" Garcia shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just that she got it wrong, it's that she didn't even know what she was looking for. She thought that calling in a complaint automatically gave her some kind of leverage, but the law doesn't work like that. The city requires written complaints to be reviewed by the council before any kind of action can be taken." And Karen Shea wasn't just misinformed, she didn't care to get the facts straight. She just assumed her voice was enough to shut you down. Kyle's mind raced. So much of this situation had been about Karen's presumptions. She had used her position in the neighborhood to bully him, to force him into submission, but she hadn't even understood the law she was trying to wield against him. He realized that the real issue wasn't just that Karen had targeted him, but that she had done so without understanding the power she had over others. Her influence was built on ignorance, and now it was exposed for what it truly was. But Kyle wasn't about to let that revelation go unnoticed. He felt a surge of determination rising within him. This wasn't just about standing up to Karen, it was about making sure this didn't happen again. He needed to make sure the neighborhood knew the truth about her, about how she had used her power recklessly. He turned to Garcia. "Do you think the city will do anything about her now?" After all this, Garcia hesitated, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. "I don't know. But the fact that she tried to pull this stunt could cause her some trouble. It's one thing to have a complaint, but she misused her position to escalate a situation based on assumptions. If she keeps this up, someone's going to start questioning her credibility." Kyle nodded slowly. He didn't want Karen's downfall to be about revenge, but he also couldn't let her actions go unchallenged. Her ignorance had nearly destroyed what he'd worked so hard to build. The fundraiser had been his way of giving back to the community, of showing that someone with a past like his could still contribute. But Karen had tried to tear it all down. As the last of the crowd began to leave, Kyle stayed behind with Garcia. For a few more moments, the officer was still flicking through the permit, clearly uneasy about the way things had played out. Kyle could tell he wanted to say more, but didn't know how. Finally, Garcia spoke again. "You know, I've seen a lot of people who've been given second chances," Garcia said quietly. "Some take it and run with it. Others, well, they waste it. But you, Kyle, you're doing something real. And I think that's something people need to see." Kyle's chest tightened, his throat suddenly dry. He wasn't used to this kind of praise, but it felt different coming from Garcia. It wasn't patronizing. It wasn't about excusing his past. It was about acknowledging the effort he had put into his present. He had fought for this moment, and for the first time, someone was recognizing that. "Thanks," Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means more than you know." As Garcia gave him a final nod and turned to leave, Kyle looked at the empty street, the remnants of the event still scattered on the ground. The day hadn't turned out the way he expected, but it had become something more than just a fight over noise levels. It had become a fight for dignity, a fight that he, against all odds, had won. And now, Karen's misplaced authority was just another example of how the truth always came to light. Even when people tried to bury it, the evening sky had already begun to dim, but Kyle remained at the center of the now quiet street, taking in the aftermath of the day's chaos. The music had long since stopped, the equipment was packed away, and the crowd had dispersed. But something inside him had changed. It wasn't just the relief of winning against Karen, or even the victory of having the truth revealed. It was deeper than that. For the first time, Kyle felt like his efforts to rebuild his life weren't just a hollow attempt to make things right. He felt seen. He felt like he had earned a new place, not just in the neighborhood, but in the eyes of the people who had once looked at him with judgment. He watched as a few of the neighbors who had stayed back after the confrontation now approached him. Some nodded respectfully. Others offered small but sincere words of encouragement. It wasn't just about the event anymore. They saw him now not as the person with a criminal past, but as the person who had worked hard, who was making a difference. He was the guy trying to help the kids who needed it the most. He was the one who had dedicated his time to teaching, to mentoring, to making sure the next generation didn't make the same mistakes he had. The evening had shifted, and Kyle was no longer just fighting for the chance to prove he deserved redemption. He had been given that redemption in real time. The realization was overwhelming. "Hey, Kyle," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Officer Garcia walking back toward him. The officer's expression was less tense now, his shoulders more relaxed, like the weight of the situation had finally lifted for him too. Kyle could tell Garcia had been thinking a lot since their last conversation. "You know," Garcia began, rubbing the back of his neck as he approached, "I wasn't sure how this was going to end up. I thought maybe it'd just be another noise complaint, one of those things that gets sorted and forgotten. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't expect it to go the way it did. And I didn't expect to see the support you've got from your community." Kyle felt a wave of gratitude flood through him. "It's been a long road. But yeah, I didn't expect this either. I didn't think people would really see me for who I am now. I didn't think they'd really give me a chance. But today, ... I think they did," Garcia nodded, looking over his shoulder at the street that was slowly emptying, the last remnants of the event fading into the background. People have a funny way of judging others based on what they've done in the past, especially when you've been through something like you have. But it's clear, it's more than just a fundraiser or some noise. You're making a real difference. Kyle couldn't help but let out a breath, a mix of relief and pride. He had always known deep down that he wasn't the same person who had been locked away. In prison, he had made mistakes, but he had paid for them. The real work, he had realized, came after. The real fight was in proving that he could change, not for the approval of others, but for himself. He didn't need to be redeemed in the eyes of the world, but today it felt good to know that people were starting to see him for who he had become, not just who he had been. The conversation shifted, and soon Kyle and Garcia were talking about more than just the incident that had taken place. They shared stories about their own lives, Garcia's struggles with his own past mistakes, Kyle's dreams of expanding his youth program. They spoke with a mutual understanding that only two people who had been judged unfairly in different ways could have. "I've got some contacts at the city council," Garcia said after a pause. "If you want, I can help you get some more support for your program. I know there's a budget review coming up, and they're looking for new initiatives to fund." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. "Really? That'd be amazing. I've been trying to get more resources for the kids, but it's tough, you know?" "I know," Garcia replied, "but I think they'd be willing to listen now. You've got the community behind you, and they'll respect that. You've earned it." The sense of possibility that washed over Kyle was like nothing he'd felt before. This wasn't just a legal win or a personal victory over Karen. It was the moment he realized his fight for redemption was gaining real momentum. He had felt invisible, like the world was focused on his past mistakes, but now it was different. His story was finally his to tell. As the two men parted ways, Kyle walked back toward the community center, the site of the fundraiser. The evening was quiet now, but the street felt alive with a new energy, a new sense of possibility. He thought about the kids he had been working with, how much potential they had, how much they needed guidance, and how far he had come to be in a position to offer that. In that moment, Kyle knew he couldn't stop now. He had fought for this. He had fought for a chance to prove his worth, and he had been given it, not just by the city, not just by Officer Garcia, but by the people around him who had finally seen through the judgment and the labels. They saw the real Kyle now, and that was the greatest victory of all. Kyle's redemption wasn't just about a permit or an event. It was about proving that even someone with a broken past could rebuild, could change, and could make a difference. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. The days that followed were a blur of emails, meetings, and a flurry of support from the community. The victory over Karen had reverberated through the neighborhood in ways Kyle hadn't anticipated. He had expected some small measure of satisfaction from the outcome. But what he hadn't expected was the groundswell of solidarity that followed. People were starting to talk not about his past, not about his mistakes, but about what he was doing now. The kids in the neighborhood, the ones who were at risk of falling through the cracks, were suddenly the focus, and Kyle was at the center. Of it all, it didn't take long for the ripple effect to hit the local council. With Officer Garcia's help, Kyle's youth program was granted a larger budget. The city's leaders saw what the community saw, that Kyle wasn't just throwing a fundraiser for his own gain. He was creating something bigger than himself, something that gave hope to kids who had never been given a real shot at success. The council members, many of whom had dismissed Kyle's efforts before, were now in full support of his program. For the first time, Kyle felt like his redemption wasn't just a personal matter. It was something that others were beginning to believe in as well. But as things began to fall into place, Kyle couldn't ignore the lingering presence of Karen. She had been quiet in the days after the event, but Kyle knew that silence wasn't her style. The woman who had tried to tear him down so publicly wouldn't just fade into the background. She had too much to prove, and she wouldn't let this defeat go unnoticed. He knew she would be back-end when she came. One afternoon, discussing future projects with his team, when the door opened and Karen stepped in. Her expression was unreadable, her posture stiff, as if she had steeled herself for what she was about to do. Everyone knew who she was, and everyone had heard the stories. But no one spoke as she walked toward Kyle, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Kyle," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "We need to talk." Kyle stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. He had prepared for this moment, but even so, a flicker of anger rose in his chest. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to prove himself, and Karen still had the audacity to walk in here as if she had any right to challenge him. "Talk about what?" Kyle asked, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him again. "That I'm sorry for the way I acted. I was wrong to go after you like that." Kyle had expected some form of apology, but this was different. This was more than just a half-hearted concession. Kyle repeated, his voice steady, but the weight of the question was there. "You're sorry for trying to ruin everything I've been working for targeting me because of my past." "I was wrong, Kyle, I admit it, but I want to fix it. I want to make it right." For a long moment, he said nothing. "You didn't just mess with me, Karen. You messed with a lot of people who trusted me. And it wasn't just about the event. It was about you using your influence to make me feel like I didn't belong. You made a choice to tear me down, and you can't take that back with a simple apology." Karen's face flushed, her eyes narrowing as if she were about to say something, but she held back. She seemed to recognize the truth in his words, the finality in his tone. There was no taking back what she had done, no quick fix for the damage she had caused. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved with a few words. Karen muttered, her voice low. I know it's not that simple, but I want to do better. Kyle met her gaze, and for a long moment, he considered her words. He thought about all the times he had let people walk over him, all the times he had allowed others to define his worth. This time, he wasn't going to let it happen again. He had earned his place here, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him, least of all someone like Karen. You want to make it right? Kyle asked, his voice steady but resolute. Support the program, support the kids, show that you've learned something. That's the only way you'll ever make this right. Karen didn't speak for a moment, but she nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of his words had finally landed. She knew, as Kyle knew, that this was the only way forward. Actions, not words, would define her from here on out. As she turned to leave, but it was enough. He had stood his ground. He had fought for his redemption, and in doing so, had earned the respect of those who mattered. For the first time in a long while, Kyle felt at peace. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now at least he was walking it with his head held high. His redemption wasn't just a battle won, it was a life he was finally starting to live on his own terms.